welcome you all to the Sudbury Historical Society's February program. And a special welcome to the members of the Wayland, formerly East Sudbury, Historical Society. Please take time to check out our table in the back, and if you haven't already viewed our archaeological exhibit upstairs, please call our curator, Lee Swanson. Where is he? He's here somewhere. And you could arrange a tour. Our number is everywhere, but if you don't have it, it's 443-3747. I was going to say a special thanks to Rick Dorman of Sudbury Cable TV, but I understand he's stuck in Providence with a dead battery. So luckily we have Peggy Fredrickson and Linda, I don't know what her last name is, and our faithful Bob Gottberg, who will be doing this for cable TV. And I'd like to thank Betsy Gottberg also for coordinating the refreshments. One more business note. Please mark your calendars for next month. 1 month from today, March 9th, the Sudbury Historical Society will be here, same time, same place, and we will present Cheryl Salatino, a Sudbury resident, who will show her vision for Route 20, how it was and how it can be. And more specifically, she's calling it Reaching Back to Create a Vibrant Future for the Sudbury Business District. Check your local newspapers. Just as I was leaving my house, I was looking at some quotes, and a man named Joseph Wood Crutch, some of you historians may have heard of him, has a very interesting quote. The most serious charge which can be brought against New England is not Puritanism, but February. And you people have proved him wrong today, because we have a great group. I think we're ready to introduce our speaker, finally. In conjunction with Black History Month, the Sudbury Historical Society is pleased to present this program entitled Slavery in Sudbury, through the eyes of slave owners and also with a slave's perspective. Jane Siaka, our presenter, is trained in history and experienced for 10 years as a National Park Service Ranger in interpretation, mostly at the Wayside, Concord, former home of the Alcott family, where the Alcotts were known to have sheltered fugitive slaves. She has also served as Assistant Director of Orchard House, Concord, the home of the abolitionist Alcott family from 1858 to 1877. Mrs. Siaka is currently on the Board of Directors of the Wayland Historical Society. She has researched journals in state archives, in Mass Historical Society, and local archives, and anywhere else she could, to find information for today's lecture. Please join me in welcoming Jane Siaka.
Thank you all for coming, number one thing, and welcome to my granddaughter to her first lecture ever. And it would be interesting to know. It'd be interesting to know if she makes it farther than her father used to do when he was young. But anyway, be that as it may, thank you for coming. Abolitionist and future Wayland resident Lydia Mariah Child wrote in her 1833 book, Condemning Slavery, an appeal in favor of that class of Americans called Africans. While we bestow our earnest disapprobation on the system of slavery, let us not flatter ourselves that we are in reality any better than our brethren of the South. Thanks to our soil and climate and the early exertions of the Quakers, the form of slavery does not exist among us, but the very spirit of the hateful and mischievous thing is here in all its strength. Mrs. Child will be 201 years old on Tuesday. At long last, the author of such bestsellers as The Frugal Housewife and The Mother's Book is shedding her image as the Dr. Spock and Martha Stewart of the 1830s. And I mean Martha Stewart in her living and her domesticity, not in her stock transactions. Okay. Although still best known for her poem beginning with the lines "Over the meadow and through the woods," Mrs. Child is being recognized today for the overwhelming passion of her life, equality and humanity for all Americans, whatever their color or gender might happen to be. When Lydia Maria Child was born in 1802 in Medford, Massachusetts, slavery was legal in the United States. And while she was well aware that slavery had once existed in the North, and in fact still existed in some northern states at that time, as she grew to adulthood, the question of abolishing slavery throughout the country took precedence over where it had once been. Lydia Maria Child worked as an ardent abolitionist until slavery ended after the Civil War. But her commitment to the former slaves did not end there. She worked for and with the freedmen and women to break down barriers to prejudice and improve opportunities for African Americans. So, therefore, I say happy birthday, Mrs. Child, and with some presumption, I'd like to dedicate this talk to you. Today, we are going to talk mainly about slavery in Sudbury, but also a little about New England slavery in general. By Sudbury, I mean what is today Sudbury and Wayland. Slavery in Massachusetts ended at about the same time that Sudbury split into two towns. When I talk about people without mentioning where they lived, I am talking about people who lived in Sudbury before the town was divided. The Massachusetts Constitution of 1780 ended slavery in Massachusetts, and by 1783, there were no slaves living in the state. Now, why the discrepancy? Because several slaves actually presented court challenges to their masters not giving them their freedom, and in 1783, by judicial decree, it was decided that, in fact, when a constitution says that all men are free and equal, there is no slavery allowed. So that's why the 3-year discrepancy. In 1790, when the first federal census came out, Massachusetts was the only state that had no slaves. As Massachusetts was the first state to abolish slavery, so it was the first colony to give legal sanction to slavery. That was in 1641 in what is ironically called the Body of Liberties. The reason that the Body of Liberties did not establish slavery is because there already had been slaves in Massachusetts before that date. When the Puritans came over in 1630 and founded what is known as the Massachusetts Bay Colony, they had only indentured servants bound to work for someone for a specified length of time, usually the biblical 7 years. As time went by, the Puritans, in addition to white indentured servants that were known in England, added Indians and Negroes to the list. Slavery, the Puritans came from a country where there was no slavery, so the Puritans had to start from scratch. Here in New England, they had to invent slavery as it pertained to the North. As time passed, more loopholes had to be closed. In 1638 is usually considered the probable date of the first importation of slaves into New England from the West Indies. By 1644, Boston traders decided to import slaves directly from Africa, but what about the children of these imported slaves who were born in America? In 1670, the Body of Liberties was amended to take care of that and to make it legally possible for children of slaves to become slaves themselves. Almost nothing is known about slaves in Massachusetts or Sudbury before 1700. Lack of wills, poor record keeping, the fact that there were no newspapers and therefore no ads for slave sales or rewards for runaways. At this point, I have found no individual slaves or slave owners living in Sudbury before 1700. But that does not mean that there were no slaves here. In fact, there is evidence that there were slaves in Sudbury as early as 1653, when there was a difference of opinion as to how a new land grant would be distributed. Most of the freemen of the town wanted the land to be divided equally, but a small number had a different suggestion. And I'll read. The lands shall be divided by the inhabitants according to their several estates and families, and counting the family to be husband, wife, children, and such servants as men have that they have either bought or brought up. Why should this method of dividing the land be proposed in 1653 if no one in the town had been bought up, by which they mean slaves? Still, that is all I have discovered so far on slavery in Sudbury in the 17th century. At this point, we might ask ourselves why New England had any slaves at all. That often comes as a surprise to people. As Mrs. Child pointed out, our soil and climate made it impossible for slaves to do the year-round field work needed on the southern plantations. As we move through to the 18th century, we find that New England is the center of colonial shipping in America. It is also the center of the slave trade in America. It was a major source of the income of the New England merchants. While most slaves, and presumably the strongest, were sold in the South or the West Indies before the ships returned to their northern ports, some slaves were saved for the local clientele. New England chronically suffered from a labor shortage, and those men who had need of extra workers and the money to buy them owned slaves. Now, the question I'm asked most often is, when I say that I've been working on this presentation, is were the slave owners looked down upon, or better yet, shunned by the rest of colonial society? I think that Massachusetts native John Adams, while serving as the vice president under George Washington, addresses that issue quite nicely. So this is John Adams speaking. I have through my whole life held the practice of slavery in such abhorrence that I have never owned a Negro or any other slave, though I have lived for many years in times when the practice was not disgraceful, when the best men in my vicinity thought it not inconsistent with their character, and when it has cost me thousands of dollars for the labor and subsistence of free men, which I might have saved from the purchase of Negroes at times when they were very cheap. So said John Adams. The earliest mention that I have found of a slave in Sudbury is in the will of Samuel Parris, who died in 1720. Reverend Samuel Parris is much better known in Salem, where he is intimately connected with the witch trials of 1692. In fact, the witchcraft scare started in Reverend Parris's house with his daughter Betty, her cousin Abigail Williams, and Parris's slave Tituba, who supposedly stirred up the girls with tales of witches in the West Indies where she had lived until Samuel Parris brought her with him from Barbados. In 1697, Reverend Parris was now relocated in Sudbury with his second wife, and he served for many years as Sudbury's schoolmaster. I was interested to find out whether Samuel Parris owned slaves at the time of his death, or whether he had been scared off from doing that by the horrors in Salem. He was not. At his death, he left an Indian girl named Violet, as he spelled it, worth 30 pounds. If Violet was with Reverend Parris when he first arrived in Sudbury, this could be a slave that would go back to the 17th century. By Indian girl, I feel fairly confident that he means West Indian rather than Native American, because that was how he always referred to Tituba, who we knew came from the West Indies. There has even been speculation, but no proof, that Violet was Tituba's daughter. I will talk later about the difficulty presented in trying to separate slaves from servants in Massachusetts, because their masters referred to both as servants. And that wasn't very kind to a later researcher like me. But the group I will talk about today are people that I can absolutely tell you were slaves. There is documented proof. No one can imagine that New England treated its slaves like slaves on a southern plantation, and in many cases this is true. As Lorenzo Green pointed out in The Negro in Colonial New England, to meet the demands of New England's diversified economy, the slave had to be more skilled and more versatile than the average plantation Negro accustomed to the routine cultivation of a single crop. The Puritans passed no laws denying or limiting a slave's right to learn. In fact, learning was encouraged because of the Puritan belief that everyone should have personal knowledge of the Bible. Jerusha Howe of Sudbury recalled that Portsmouth, the slave of her grandfather, Ezekiel Howe, had acquired great knowledge of the Bible, could write very well, and was blessed with a strong retentive memory. In 1736, Reverend Israel Loring received a letter from Nero Benson, the slave of Reverend Swift of Framingham. Nero obviously could write, but you'll hear more about him and his family later. Unlike the South, slaves in Sudbury most often slept in their master's house and were considered in many respects part of the family. Of course, slaves were also considered part of a man's property, like a bed, the dishes, or a horse. In fact, deeds for selling slaves were called property deeds and followed the same format as a property deed. This, of course, is confusing to us and perhaps to the slave as well, who occupied a nether world where he or she was the master's property and a member of the household. Slaves usually ate at the same table as the rest of the family. Slaves in Massachusetts could own property. This does not mean that many did, but it was not against the law. In certain cases, a slave could earn wages when he worked for someone other than his master. What's the catch? These could only be done with the consent of the master. In fact, that simple phrase, with the consent of his master, pretty much sums up what defined the life of a slave in Sudbury or in the rest of Massachusetts. The slave's treatment was at the mercy of his owner. Could slaves be beaten? Of course, Puritans were known for their spare the rod and spoil the child philosophy, as well as the stocks, the ducking stool, and other punishments. Is it reasonable to assume that slaves would not be punished if white people were? While no slave master in Sudbury mentioned beating a slave, one wonders about the violent acts that are not recorded. We find one incident of violence. Thank you to Reverend Loring in 1729. In his diary, he writes, "Heard of the sad accident fallen out in the family of Mr. Josiah Brown, his Negro manservant dangerously wounding himself by a gun which he designedly discharged against himself. Both shot and wadding went into his body. Reverend Loring later preached he would have killed himself, but Paul cried with a loud voice, 'Do thyself no harm.' What could have led to this? We can only imagine." Slave marriages. I'd like to talk a little bit about slave marriages. Unlike the South, where slaves were forbidden to marry, Puritan slaves were encouraged to marry. Sex without marriage was a big no-no to them, whether you were a slave or were free. But what did marriage mean for a slave? Basically, it gave legal sanction to sexual intimacy. Slaves did not assume the Mr. and Mrs. They did not share a name. In fact, most of them didn't even have last names. They still remained the property of their respective masters and were still subject to their authority. Owners' desires had priority. The sanction of parental rights and duties lay not in the slave mother and father, but in the master. Economic considerations might result in the breakup of a slave family at any time. Husband and wife could be sold or given to masters in different localities. For example, Reverend John Swift of Framingham left 5 slaves in his will in 1745, including a married couple, Nero Benson and Dido, who had been married for over 20 years. Nero became the property of Dr. Ebenezer Roby of Sudbury, and Dido and her daughter remained in Framingham with the Swift family. Cuff and Hager, who were the servants of Colonel Noyes, or slaves of Colonel Noyes, when they married in 1762, they would live together because they did live together in the same household. But they would only live together until or unless Colonel Noyes sold one or both, or until he died and divided them in his will. There are also examples of slaves in the records who married each other and did not live together. Dinah, who was a slave of Josiah Richardson, married Caesar, the servant of Mrs. Love Flint of Lincoln, in 1761. Slave children could be sold, and Phoebe, a slave of Josiah Richardson, was sold to the widow Balsh of Framingham for £1, 6 shillings, 8 pence in 1764. Phoebe was a Negro female child of about 2 years old. Her mother, if indeed also in Josiah Richardson's household, was not sold. Central to the understanding of life in colonial Sudbury and in Massachusetts is the importance of the church to the Puritans. It was the reason they came to the New World in the first place. And central to our knowledge about the church are the letters, journals, and sermons of the ministers. Regardless of whether his parishioners would agree, I feel blessed that Israel Loring served as Sudbury's minister for 66 years, from 1706 until his death in 1772. His written words, at least what remains of them, and it's a lot, cover almost all the 18th century in Sudbury before slavery was declared illegal. African Americans could be admitted to church membership, whether slave or free. Slaves could take part in prayer and singing, could take communion. Whether or not it was after white people did is unknown. Slaves could transfer from one church to another, as you will see when we talk about Nero Benson. Negroes could not vote on church discipline as far as we know. Segregated in seat in the church, how much this was due to social status rather than color, we don't know. Negroes were also segregated in graveyards as well. Lorenzo Green, again in The Negro in Colonial New England, remarked that the slave in death sometimes receives a recognition which was denied him in life. Although Reverend Loring left no slaves at the time of his death, he was a slave owner during his lifetime. In his History of Sudbury, Hudson specifically cites Reverend Loring's love and esteem for his slave Simeon, also known as Simeon Harry. Simeon was born in Reverend Loring's house, and for whatever reason, which is not stated, Simeon, at the age of 21, was given his freedom, or as Reverend Loring put it, freed for my service and for himself. Simeon's freedom was short-lived. Less than a month later, on the 30th of April in 1755, Simeon was taken ill with colic, but soon recovered. He didn't recover for long. On May 10th, Simeon grew worse again and died. Reverend Loring wrote, "He was greatly beloved by the family, and his death has drowned us in tears. A few days later, Reverend Loring wrote, "In the evening we committed the remains of Simeon to the dark and silent grave. A great number of the congregation attended the funeral." On May 13th, Reverend Loring wrote, "My wife, before Simeon died, took to her bed, being overcome and worn out through labor of body and distress of mind about Simeon." There is more to the story of Simeon that is not in Hudson. Reverend Loring also wrote on the day that Simeon died, "The Lord sanctify this death to us all, particularly to the mother of the deceased." This is the first time we hear about a mother of Simeon. And who was his mother? That we find out on May 17th when Reverend Loring wrote, "Died Susanna Harry, sister to our hired woman servant Hannah, the loss of her son and now of her sister." So we know Hannah was Simeon's mother. Just very, very nice. We'd have no idea otherwise. We also find out from this sentence that Hannah is not a slave. That's hence the word hired. By 1755, however, she had not always been free. Earlier references in Reverend Loring's diary call her his Negro maid servant, indicating that she had been a slave. There is no mention of when Hannah was given her freedom, but I can venture a reason why she might have been given her freedom. In February of 1742, Reverend Loring recorded that his study caught fire, and through the great goodness of God and endeavors of my servant maid Hannah and Mrs. Hayden, it was extinguished and the house preserved. What does this all mean? Doubtless the Loring family loved Simeon, but as what? His tombstone stated that Simeon was the faithful and beloved servant of Israel Loring. And what did freedom mean for Simeon and Hannah, who, while no longer slaves, would continue to serve the same master? There are no emancipation papers existing, if they ever existed, for Simeon and Hannah. In fact, only one emancipation paper that I have found exists, and that was for Nero Benson, who I mentioned later. Now you're going to hear more about him. Reverend Loring also provided a wealth of information on Nero, but his story starts with another minister, and that's Reverend John Swift of Framingham. Nero Benson was the slave of Reverend Swift, but an unusual one, to say the least. Nero Benson was known for his musical talent, so much so that in 1725 he was trumpeter in Captain Isaac Clark's militia troop. By this time, Nero was also married. In 1721, Nero married Dido Dingo, also a slave of Reverend Swift's, and their records still appear. It is still in the Framingham town records, so that we know this marriage occurred. While still a slave of Reverend Swift's in 1737, Nero made application and was received in the church in Hopkinton, as were a number of white members who had formerly been part of Reverend Swift's congregation. Before that, Nero had written a letter to Reverend Loring in Sudbury asking him to intervene in this matter. According to Reverend Loring's diary, the letter was read to the church, and after some debate upon it, it was voted that the affair should be dismissed. Thus ended Nero's first encounter with Reverend Loring, but there was more to come. Reverend Swift died in 1745, and his 5 slaves were divided in his will, as I mentioned before, while Dido, his wife of almost 25 years, and her daughter, presumably also Nero's daughter, stayed in Framingham with the Swift family. Nero was left to Dr. Ebenezer Roby of Sudbury, Reverend Swift's son-in-law. By 1747, Nero no longer was Dr. Roby's slave. He belonged to a man named Samuel Wood, who gave him his freedom in the only discovered emancipation paper that pertains to Sudbury. And in it, Samuel Wood declared that, said Nero Benson is absolutely a free man and fully set at liberty from all slavery whatsoever by or under me. And he also had to, Samuel Wood, in order to free Nero Benson, he had to pay £100 to the town of Sudbury so that in case Nero couldn't earn his own living, the town would not have to pay his expenses. Emancipation meant the former slave would pay for the support of his former slave if he ever became a town charge. And so along with the emancipation paper, you get that he indemnified and saved the town harmless from all or any charges towards the support and maintenance of Negro man named Nero Benson. So not only is Samuel Wood not making money from having a slave, he is actually giving up money to have an emancipation. I am not surprised there's not too many of those papers to be found. Nearly a year before Nero was granted his freedom, he again appealed to Reverend Loring, asking to become a member of the church in Sudbury, and he was admitted in November 1746. By 1753, Nero, no longer a slave, is back in Reverend Loring's diary. He and another member of the church, Cornelius Wood, whom I believe is the brother of the emancipator Samuel Wood, were embroiled in a dispute. The matter was settled when Nero Benson acknowledged that he had wronged Cornelius Wood in reporting that he had taken a false oath. Reverend Loring was clearly relieved and thanked God for settling the unhappy differences between Cornelius Wood and Nero Benson, which endangered still wider breaches in the church. Not only was the church important to Nero Benson, but we also find out that Nero Benson was important to the church. And one last entry from Reverend Loring on the 4th of July, 1757. This day attended the funeral of Nero Benson, who died at the schoolhouse July 3rd, Lord's Day. A Negro man admitted into the church November 9, 1746, left behind him a widow and 3 children. And I want to say, sort of to digress for a minute, it was much to my shock and amazement when in 1761, 4 years after Nero Benson died, he then appeared in the town records at town meeting, and figuring out that it was not obviously the same Nero Benson, but yet you don't go into this thinking you're going to come across too many Nero Bensons. I came across several Simeon Harrys as well. Thus ends the saga of Nero Benson. There is more about Dido after his death, who by that time was apparently also free. She is found in Sudbury town meeting and poor records asking for the town to support her. While we know more about Nero Benson than about any other Sudbury slave, so much more lies beneath the surface. I feel the loss of a great story about an obviously fascinating individual who lived in Sudbury. What a treasure we would have if only Nero had written down some of it himself. And we know he could write. Probably unwritten and possibly missing, to me there is an overwhelming message. Nothing we know about slaves in Sudbury comes from the slave. It all comes from the master class. Along with Nero Benson's, there are many more stories I would love to hear told by the slave. Here's an example that comes from the diary of Jerusha Howe, who died in 1842. She is talking about Portsmouth, or Ponto as he was called. Portsmouth was the slave of her grandfather, Ezekiel Howe, the proprietor of what today is the Wayside Inn. Stories about Ponto refusing his freedom when slavery was declared illegal have come down through the ages. Let me first of all say that whether or not Ponto wanted to be free after 1783, he was. So the codicil to Ezekiel Howe's will that he wrote before his death in 1796 has been a source of confusion, and I'll quote it. My will is that my old Negro servant Portsmouth shall be subject to the orders of my wife in such matter and things as may be necessary in assisting her about her household concerns, and said servant shall be well and comfortably supported through life, both in sickness and health, with all things suitable and necessary for a person of his age and quality, and after his decease be buried in decent and Christian burial. I have come to conclude that Ezekiel Howe was well aware of the fact that Portsmouth was no longer his slave, because along with the will is the inventory of Ezekiel Howe's estate, and Portsmouth is not listed as part of the inventory as he would have been had he died 20 years earlier. But that the intent really was that a decent Christian burial be given to Portsmouth on his death, no matter who was still living that was carrying out the wishes of Ezekiel Howe. Now, Jerusha Howe talks about Portsmouth as well, writing just before 1842. No, I don't have my centuries wrong. The Negro man who took care of me when a young child and to whom I became very much attached was purchased by Ezekiel Howe, my grandfather, of Mr. William Baldwin of Sudbury, administrator of the estate of Captain Reynolds Seeger, for 44 pounds lawful money in April of 1773. The instrument said he was about 33 years of age, from the Guinea coast, while at play with other children, and was carried aboard ship. He remembered screaming for his mother when men took him, one under each arm, to carry him off. While Portsmouth grew to accept and maybe even enjoy his role in the Howe household, it is obvious that he never got over his home in Africa or his family. That is a story I would have liked to hear more of from Ponto. When I agreed to give this talk, way back when, I worried that I'd have about 3 minutes of things to say about slaves in Sudbury. And now I worry the opposite, that I have too much to say. I also want to allow time for questions and comments. But first, I'd like to say something about how I identified slaves in Sudbury. I also want to say a few words about the many African Americans I came across in my research who fall into that gray area. They probably were slaves, but there is no documented proof. So those I did not talk about for time considerations. I have omitted them, as I say, but I have numerous references to them. As I mentioned to begin with, it all starts with the fact that servants and slaves in Massachusetts were both called servants. So how do you go about finding out if somebody is really a slave? One source are census records. The first federal census in 1790 reported Massachusetts as having no slaves. However, there are earlier census records that indicate that there were slaves and slave owners. In 1771, in Massachusetts, there was a poll taken, a provincial tax. 38,000 taxpayers were polled, and they owned 1,169 adult servants for life. This included Indian, Negro, or mulatto from ages 14 to 45. 12 slave owners on that list lived in Sudbury. We have their names and number of slaves they owned, needed for the tax purposes. No names of the slaves are given. In 1754, they actually had a colony, Massachusetts Bay Colony had a slave census, and they appointed assessors in each town to report the number of slaves. In Sudbury, there were 9 male and 5 female slaves. No names of the slaves or the slave owners were included on that survey. In 1749, in the town clerk's office in Sudbury still exists a Sudbury tax list. The evaluation specifies that there were 17 slaves in Sudbury. Again, no names of the slaves or of their owners. So that's one way. The 12 slave owners in Sudbury in 1771 were taxed for 1 slave each. First of all, any slaves under 14 or over 45 were not included. So to begin with, we don't know the actual slave population. Nevertheless, the impression is given that 1 slave per family was the usual number. We can disprove this from wills that have survived in the Middlesex County probate records and in estate inventories. As we saw earlier, Reverend Swift left 5 slaves at his death, but of course that was in Framingham. However, David Baldwin of Sudbury topped that figure when he died in 1770 and left 6 slaves. Of course, that was a year before the census was taken in 1771. In his will, he left to his son William, a Negro boy, Juba. The rest are all Negro girls. Candace to his son Samuel, Violet to daughter Abigail, Nancy to daughter Elizabeth, Chloe to daughter Lydia, and Nell to his daughter Mary. Were any of these slaves related? We don't know. Josiah Richardson left 2 slaves on his death in 1770, his Negro girl Dinah to his wife Experience, and his Negro man Frank Benson, here's that name again, to his son Josiah Jr. He had already sold his 2-year-old slave Phoebe in 1764. Frank Benson, who once had also been Reverend Swift of Framingham's slave, was married to Reverend Loring's hired servant, Hannah, the mother of Simeon. So there was a lot of, they did not live together. The Noyes family genealogy, written in 1904, claims that Colonel John Noyes in 1715, who lived from 1715 to 1785, owned much real estate and a considerable number of slaves. Existing information shows that Colonel Noyes sold a slave named Cato to Jonas Noyes in 1767, and also he was the master of Cuff and Hager, who were married in the 1760s. In addition to wills, we have property deeds for slaves and a receipt for payment. These include, in addition to those already mentioned, the sale of Frank Benson to Josiah Richardson in 1745. The seller was Reverend John Swift of Acton, who inherited Frank when his father, the Framingham minister, died. A 1779 receipt for payment is to Ezekiel Howe, who paid 200 pounds for a Negro girl. By the way, slaves could be bought for either cash or credit. That's why you would have a receipt for payment. I found a reference to the freeing of a slave in the diary of Experience White Richardson, Josiah Sr.'s wife. December 9, 1776, this day my servant Dinah had her freedom. As someone who worked in a Revolutionary War park for 10 years, I cannot overlook the significance of the date, so soon after the Declaration of Independence. Although it is impossible to assess the degree of anti-slavery sentiment in Sudbury, why, for example, did Samuel Wood free Nero Benson, I think Mrs. Richardson's later diary entry leads me to conclude that some people in Sudbury must have been opposed to human bondage. On January 2nd, 1777, Mrs. Richardson wrote, "Oh, now that I live alone, I may converse with God more than ever. The last of my family is gone. Now Dinah is gone." There is little doubt that Mrs. Richardson would have liked Dinah to stay, and little doubt that Dinah chose not to when given her freedom. I'm going to stop at this point and tired of hearing my own voice and would love to hear some questions or comments from any of you. So thank you. Ursula.
Yes,
Yes. I did, actually. I did, actually. But again, he was in the gray area, Cato, but there was a Cato fair has been mentioned in the town records. Several Catos have been mentioned in the town records, which I have. Was it possible that it was named for Cato? Yes, it is possible. I know Concord, where I've worked for many years, you have Brister's Hill and other streets that were named for African Americans. George.
Many Leyland residents are familiar with the Old North Cemetery on Old Sudbury Road. And in the older part of that cemetery are two headstones. One is for Flora, a colored lady. And the other is for Peter Booth.
Yeah, isn't that nice?
And the stones are somewhat
Repeat the
smaller
question.
than the stones in that section of the cemetery, and they are placed at 90 degrees to the placement of all the other stones in that section of the cemetery. And I would guess, I think there may be a date on one of them, but probably in the 1840, 50 era.
Okay, I've been asked, because this is being recorded, to repeat what people say, because otherwise it's not going to be picked up on the cable. So I have to say that George Lewis was referring to two gravestones in the North Cemetery in current-day Wayland, and they are placed at an angle that indicates that they were servants at the least, maybe slaves. What I can tell you is they weren't slaves when they died. Whether they had ever been slaves, that I don't know. So basically, I can assuredly tell you they were not, and I believe it does say servant on it, and there's where you get into that again. This time they mean servant, because no one could be a slave here at the time of their death. Oh, John.
How many of the probates did you come through in the relevant era?
Okay, thank you for asking that question. The question was, how many probates did I go through for the relevant era? Not enough. One of the problems is that, for example, taking the list of the 1771 slaveholders, which would be an obvious place to start, they all died after slavery was declared illegal, so they're not going to leave slaves. The other was the absence of the wills. So who did I look at? I read Reverend Parris's will at the State Archives. I read the senior Josiah Richardson. I read Jonas Noyes, but John Noyes wasn't there. I read a good number of them in the 17th century, if they were there. Then I read in the 18th century. If they were there, I tried to read them. For example, I found out that Reverend Loring's father had left him a slave, because they're now all at the State Archives out on the end of Columbia Point. So you can have access not just to Middlesex County, but you can do other counties at the same time. They're all on microfilm, hard to read. So I did as many as possible. Some I found out had not had slaves when they died. But there's a wonderful opportunity where I'd love to go back, and probably will, and look into some more of the people. But the people I knew as identified slaveholders, I did look at their wills and their families, if it did exist in the records. Yes.
What was the practice of the burial of the slaves? Was it a separate section? Were they buried with the rest of the family that they lived with? Or does it depend on when they died and where they died?
Well, so many of the gravestones and graves of the, oh, yes, thank you. What was the burial practice of slaves? Were they buried with their family? Were they buried separately in a separate section? I only know the few examples that I gave that George Lewis talked about, servants in later living in Wayland, Simeon buried with his with the Loring family, but they're usually placed at an angle. So many of the gravestones cannot be found, so many of the graves can't be found that it's really impossible, again, to have an accurate assessment or even a very complete one of where they were buried. I think that it was found that, at least in New England, servants were buried in a fashion to show that they were not the white people. Okay. I didn't hear that.
Where was Simeon buried?
Simeon was buried right here in Sudbury Center. Yes, he's right here. Right. She's indicating that there is a mark. I have not seen the grave because of the weather, unfortunately. Oh, it talks about what's on the gravestone. It's in Hudson. Right, right. And, well, they know he was buried there. I don't know in what form his grave is. Israel Loring. Reverend Israel Loring. You look like you want to say something. Do you know the answer? Yeah. Oh, okay. Ursula.
You mentioned most of the slaves had just one name, but then you mentioned Hero Benson, another Benson. Do you have any way of knowing where Benson came from or how some people had it too?
Okay, the question was surnames of slaves, and in particular the name Benson. In thinking about it, I don't even know if Frank Benson, who was also a slave of Reverend Swift, along with Nero Benson, if they were related, or maybe Reverend Swift gave them the name Benson, maybe they wanted a last name. I think it could be any permutation that you wanted it to be. Normally, slaves did not have last names. Nero, as you can see, was not your ordinary slave or person, for that matter. But, you know, in even looking at the rest of the Benson family, Francis Benson, can I say with certainty that he was related to Nero Benson? I don't know. I mean, I thought that I could, and then when I thought about it more seriously, I realized that no, that could have been a name that Reverend Swift decided that they should be Bensons, but I don't know the answer to that. Yes? No, they very often would be. Okay, when a slave was given his freedom, was he given a plot of land? No, he was given the clothes, usually went with his freedom, and he could become a hired man. I suspect that most of the freed slaves became hired men. If he had earned money and had some money, he could buy land. But no, did that come with emancipation? No, usually a suit of clothes came with emancipation. It could be either case. Okay, where would the slave live? After Nero Benson, again, I have to, take my cues from what I've seen. Nero Benson died a free man. He died very specifically, Reverend Loring said, at the schoolhouse. Perhaps he was taking care of the schoolhouse, and he was allowed to live there because he was a caretaker in some form. So basically, it's just how it worked out. I don't know. It didn't land. Nothing necessarily came with freedom, other than your suit of clothes and the master paying the town so that you didn't have to, be on the town welfare rolls if you couldn't earn your own way.
Find any records of where the slaves came from before coming to Sudbury? Did they come from a specific area, or did you find anything else?
I think that more slaves, and I base this on other work I have done. Okay, where did the slaves come from? That's my husband who's making sure I stay on track. Huh? You know that he's going to do that. So anyway, where did the slaves come from? I want to tell you that I can base this on other information and other studies I've done in New England slavery. A great many slaves came directly from Africa, even in the 1700s. Where I worked at the Wayside in Concord, there was a slave who said every night that there was a story that came down about him that every night he went to sleep and dreamed of Africa. We know that, that Portsmouth came from Africa. I have reason to believe that most of the slaves that were here in New England came direct from Africa.
I guess my question is, did they come directly, or did they come from some other part of the country? That was my question.
Oh, no, they came directly to New England. You missed that because I think you weren't here. But they were the slave trade, the masters of the slave trade, the ones who controlled the slave trade in the 1700s are the New England merchants. And while they bring the bulk of the slaves go to the South and go to the West Indies, there are a number that are brought directly from Africa to New England to help with labor shortage. That is the problem. The problem is that if you have the money and you can afford to pay, then and you need somebody to work for you, then you would buy a slave. Yes.
Did we have any slaves other than blacks?
Yes.
What race?
Indian slaves.
Big question.
Okay, do we have slaves here? Do we have slaves here other than African American? Yes, there were Indian slaves in Sudbury, and I think that you could take back more into the 1600s. But the first slaves in New England were Native American, as opposed to West Indian. The first slaves were Native American, and then gradually, as the Puritan merchants got involved in the slave trade, they also introduced African slavery. Yes, John?
Is there any kind of simple answer to why Massachusetts was the first in the state to abolish?
Yes, because why was Massachusetts the first state to abolish slavery? Why? Because of people like John Adams, and there were people. The Revolutionary War did really inspire some people to find an inconsistency between slavery and freedom. A lot of the ministers at the time were always saying, are we going to become slaves of England and other people? That was a very popular catchphrase, and I think that for a lot of people it might have percolated, what are they saying, when they're talking about, are we slaves of England, when they have slaves right here. So yes, there was anti-slavery sentiment. John Adams certainly was anti-slavery, as you've got a little taste of, and the Massachusetts Constitution is the first constitution in this country, and I've read someplace where it's the oldest document still in existence, the longest lasting constitution. So you had anti-slavery feeling, and they fought about it, but finally, when it was adopted in 1780, it was adopted with the phrase, all men are free and equal, and that pretty much says we shouldn't be having slaves here. Yes? Yeah, okay, slaves, after the question was, did slaves get a piece of land? After the Civil War, that was part of a certain agreement, but there was no agreement. There were the documents where slaves are freed or free men. They do not necessarily have any land that is given to them. As again, if they had land, they most likely bought it. I came across several wills, actually, of African Americans who did own land, not in Sudbury, but in Natick, and but as far as I know, this is not a practice that existed before emancipation in 1865. Yes. You took me to understand. Were slave children sold? Were slave children sold? You took me to say that we have documented proof that a slave girl at the age of 2 was sold by a Sudbury master to a woman in Framingham. So could children be sold? Yes, they indeed could be sold. There was nothing to prevent that. Slave children belonged to the master. After 1670, when it was cleared up that slave children were slaves as well, after that they became part of the master's estate, and if the slave master wished to sell them. Now, why somebody would sell a slave who's 2 years old, I don't understand, or why someone would want to buy a slave who's 2 years old, I don't particularly understand. But yes, we have it documented, definitely can say that a slave child in Sudbury was sold to a woman in Framingham. Yes? Was a slave always bought for life? A slave was bought for life. Servant for life is another name for it. There were still indentured servants that were around at that time, white, African American, and Indian in this area, and they usually would have the specified time. And as I said, biblical, it was supposed to be 7 years, which I'm sure people like Ken Sori could explain much better than I can. But what happened is it started out really, the Puritan, the indenture starts out as pretty much 7 years as the custom. And somehow it had to evolve into life slavery, or slaves for life. So when the slave was bought as a slave, he was bought for life, because that was the only way someone could sell a slave. If you had the complete rights to sell the slave, meant that he was your property to have and to hold forever. Okay? Yes, Shirley.
Do you know whether the servants and the slaves were segregated in the churches? You talked about them being part of the family, and I wonder if they all sat together or not.
Well, yes, I don't think they did sit together, because were the slaves segregated in church? Yes, because, well, there's family and property. It's a very gray issue, but again, it would go by the class. Your seating in a church did not go by your color, it went by your social status. And a slave wouldn't have the social status to sit in the same pew as Reverend Lauren's family, for example. So yes, there was segregation in the church. How much of it there was, for example, I talked about communion. Did the slaves or African Americans have to take communion after the white people did? There seems to be no specific knowledge of that. But was there segregation in the church as well as in the graveyard? Yes. Sure. Oh. No more. No more questions.